The water was black and the air smelled of diesel and salt and something else, something chemical, the particular burning metal odor that comes off a ship's engine room when it has been running at full speed for too long. It was past midnight, the early hours of the 25th of October, 1944, and Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague was standing on the bridge of a small, lightly armoured escort carrier called the Fanshawe Bay, somewhere in the Philippine Sea, north of the island of Samar. He was a deliberate man, not given to catastrophizing. He had commanded carriers before, knew the Pacific, knew what a radar return was supposed to look like. What he was looking at now did not look like anything it was supposed to be. The returns on the screen were enormous. There were too many of them. They were close, far too close for what he had been told about enemy fleet dispositions, far too close for any situation in which the correct response was calm. He called for a visual confirmation. His lookouts trained their glasses northwest into the grey pre-dawn light, and what they described back to him was the silhouette of a pagoda mast, the layered, unmistakable superstructure of a Japanese heavy warship rising above the horizon. Then another. Then another. Then the first shell splashes appeared in the water around his ships, and the splashes were coloured, dyed red and yellow and green, different colours for different Japanese vessels, so their gunnery officers could distinguish their own fall of shot from their fleetmates, and the colours spreading across the dark water were almost beautiful, which was not a word that had any relevance to what was about to happen. What was about to happen was this: the largest battleship force the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever committed to a single surface engagement was bearing down on a group of 13 American ships. 6 of those ships were escort carriers, small, slow, built on merchant hulls, never designed to face anything heavier than a submarine or land-based aircraft. 3 were destroyers. 4 were destroyer escorts, which were smaller than destroyers, lighter, armed accordingly. None of these ships had armour that could stop a heavy cruiser's shell. Several of them could be penetrated by weapons that would not have inconvenienced a proper warship at all. The Japanese force bearing down on them included the Yamato, the largest and most heavily armed battleship ever built by any navy, anywhere, displacing over 72,000 tons at full load, armed with 9 guns of 460 mm, each barrel longer than most of the American ships it was about to engage were wide. Sprague's task unit had a designation, Taffy 3. It was a name that told you almost everything about how seriously anyone had expected it to be tested in a major surface engagement. What nobody, not Sprague, not the Japanese admiral across that widening distance, not the naval architects who had designed any of these vessels, not the strategists in Washington or Tokyo, what none of them could have predicted in that pre-dawn darkness was what Taffy 3 was about to do, or what it would cost. Часть первая. 40 лет наследия. In late May of 1905, a Russian fleet completed one of the most extraordinary voyages in naval history. The 2nd Pacific Squadron, under Vice Admiral Zinovy Petrovich Rozhesvensky, had sailed from the Baltic Sea from Libau on the coast of what is now Latvia in October of the previous year. They had travelled over 18,000 nautical miles. 7 months at sea, around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, through the South China Sea. They had coaled from German merchant ships at sea, had been nearly intercepted by the British Royal Navy after mistakenly firing on British fishing trawlers in the North Sea, had lost men to disease and heat and accident before they ever reached a battle. They arrived in the Tsushima Strait, the narrow passage between Japan and the Korean Peninsula, on the 27th of May, 1905. They were met by Admiral Togo Heihachiro. Togo was 60 years old, a compact, precise man who had studied naval warfare in England for 7 years and had spent his career building toward exactly this moment. He commanded the Japanese combined fleet from the bridge of the battleship Mikasa, a ship purchased from British yards, as were most of the serious fighting vessels in the Japanese fleet at that time. Japan had built its naval power by buying it first, then learning to replicate it. The Mikasa, the Asahi, the Shikishima, British-built, British-designed, operated by Japanese crews who had spent a decade mastering them. The battle that followed on the 27th and 28th of May was the first modern steel battleship engagement in which wireless telegraphy played a critical role in coordinating fleet movements. It was also among the most decisive naval battles ever fought. The Russians were outnumbered nearly 3-1 in total hulls. In 12 hours of fighting, Togo's fleet sank or captured virtually the entire Russian squadron. 21 of 38 Russian vessels were sunk, 6 were captured, 6 were interned in neutral ports, 3 made it to Vladivostok. Rozhestvensky was wounded and captured. Russian losses in killed and captured ran to nearly 10,000 men. Japanese losses: 3 torpedo boats sunk, 117 men killed. Stop and hold that comparison for a moment. 117 Japanese dead against nearly 10,000 Russian dead. A fleet of 38 ships reduced to 3 functional vessels in 1 day's fighting. The Battle of Tsushima did not merely end the Russo-Japanese War, it created a mythology. In Japan and in naval circles globally, it became the reference point, the proof that decisive fleet engagement, the Mahanian ideal of concentrated battleship power meeting the enemy's concentrated battleship power in a single climactic battle, actually worked. The IJN studied Tsushima the way a religion studies its founding miracle. Every officer who rose through the ranks between 1905 and 1944 did so inside an institutional culture that had Tsushima at its center. The 6-6 Fleet Program, the drive toward battleship supremacy, the Yamato and Musashi, those 69,000-ton monsters with their 18-inch guns, all of it pointed toward the same conclusion. Gather your battleships, find the enemy's main fleet, fight the decisive engagement, win. Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle. That was the strategy, that was the inheritance. But here is what the inheritance did not include. What happens when the decisive battle does not happen on schedule? What happens when the enemy refuses to present his main fleet for destruction and instead uses submarines, aircraft, and logistics to grind yours down over 3 years before the decisive moment arrives? What happens when, by the time your battleships finally reach the decisive engagement you have been preparing for since 1905, your admirals have been trained to expect one kind of war and are receiving another? The Imperial Japanese Navy built Yamato and Musashi, the 2 largest and most powerful battleships ever constructed, and used Yamato as a transport for Admiral Yamamoto's staff and used Musashi as an administrative headquarters vessel for most of 1943. The decisive battle kept not arriving. The ships kept waiting. By October of 1944, Japan was losing the war. The Marianas had fallen. American B-29s were within range of the home islands. MacArthur was returning to the Philippines. And the Imperial Japanese Navy, in one final attempt to force the Kantai-Kessen they had been waiting for since Togo's day, assembled the largest fleet they had sent to sea since Pearl Harbor and sent it toward Leyte Gulf. Часть вторая. Курита. План. И то, что пошло не так. Еще до выстрела. The operation was called Sho Ichigo, Victory Operation 1. It was not a subtle plan. It was, at its core, a Tsushima plan. Concentrate the fleet, find the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf, destroy it, and thereby make the cost of continuing the war prohibitive for the United States. The mechanics were elaborate. 3 separate Japanese forces would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions simultaneously, designed to split American attention and force Admiral William Halsey to commit his fast carriers, the most powerful American surface force in the Pacific, in the wrong direction. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would take a carrier force north of the Philippines and act as bait, drawing Halsey away. While Halsey chased Ozawa, 2 other forces would enter Leyte Gulf from the south and west, trap the American invasion fleet between them, and destroy it. The western force, the one that matters for this story, was the center force. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded it from the bridge of the heavy cruiser Yamato. No, correct that. From the bridge of the battleship Yamato. The largest battleship ever built. Kurita's force comprised 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers and 15 destroyers as it left Linga Roads near Singapore in mid-October. The Yamato, the Musashi, the Nagato, the Kongo, the Haruna. 5 battleships, including the 2 most powerful warships ever constructed. Between October 23rd and 24th, the plan began to come apart before Kurita fired a single gun at an American ship. American submarines Data and Dace intercepted the center force in the Palawan Passage on October 23rd. The Data put 4 torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship, and sank her in 18 minutes. Kurita went into the water. He was rescued, transferred his flag to Yamato, and continued. The Data then put 3 more torpedoes into the heavy cruiser Takao, putting her out of the battle. The Dace sank the heavy cruiser Maya with 4 torpedoes. 3 heavy cruisers in one morning before a single American aircraft appeared. The next day, in the Sibuyan Sea, American carrier aircraft found the center force and spent the better part of 6 hours attacking it in waves. The Musashi, 69,000 tons, the largest battleship ever built alongside her sister ship, armoured with 16-inch belt armour, capable of absorbing punishment that would destroy any other vessel afloat, took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over the course of the day. She rolled over and sank at 19:23 on October 24th. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Think about what that number means. The Musashi took 36 hits from aerial weapons, the single most intensely attacked capital ship in the history of naval warfare up to that point, and it still took hours to sink her. She absorbed punishment that would have destroyed a dozen ordinary ships, and she still died. Kurita turned his remaining force around and headed west, away from Leyte Gulf. American intelligence reported the reversal. Admiral Halsey, watching from the north, concluded that the center force had been sufficiently damaged to no longer pose a serious threat. He turned his full attention to Ozawa's carrier decoy force in the north. He was wrong. Kurita turned around again. At midnight on October 24th, the center force reversed course once more and headed east through the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea. Halsey's fast battleships and carriers were already 200 miles to the north, chasing Ozawa's empty carriers. Ozawa had almost no aircraft left, his air groups having been destroyed in the Marianas. The bait had worked perfectly. At first light on October 25th, Kurita's center force emerged from the San Bernardino Strait into the Philippine Sea, turned south, and ran directly into Taffy 3. Here is the critical detail. No one had told Clifton Sprague that Kurita was coming. Halsey had not left a single ship to guard the San Bernardino Strait. There was no warning. There was no screen. There was nothing between Kurita's 4 remaining battleships and 6 heavy cruisers and the invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf except Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts, and the men aboard them. Meet Commander Ernest Evans, 36 years old, 3/4 Cherokee, born in Pawnee, Oklahoma, Annapolis class of 1931. He had taken command of the destroyer USS Johnston in late 1943, and on the day he commissioned her, he had told his crew, in a speech that men who survived would quote for the rest of their lives, that he was going to command the Johnston as if there were no such thing as retirement. That she was going to be a fighting ship, that she would never run from a fight she could take on. At 6:46 on the morning of October 25th, without waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague, without waiting for permission, without waiting for anything, Commander Evans turned Johnston's bow toward the Japanese fleet and ordered flank speed. His ship displaced 2,050 tons. It had 5 5-inch guns. It was heading toward Yamato. Часть третья. Трехчасовая невозможность. What Clifton Sprague did in the first 90 seconds after the Japanese fleet appeared was, by any rational measure, the only thing he could have done. He turned his carriers into the wind to launch aircraft, turned southeast toward a rain squall that offered concealment, ordered his escorts to make smoke and sent the following message to all commands. Under attack by enemy surface forces. My position 10 degrees 1 minute north, 126 degrees 4 minutes east. Engaging enemy. Request immediate assistance. He did not say he was about to be destroyed. He said he was engaging the enemy. The rain squall was his first weapon. It was not much, a tropical downpour, the kind that appears and disappears in minutes. But it was something, and Sprague drove his carriers into it and used it to complicate Japanese fire control for the first critical minutes of the battle. His second weapon was the aircraft. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 carried a mixed complement of FM-2 Wildcats and TBF Avengers, fighters and torpedo bombers. They had been armed and loaded for ground support missions over Leyte, which meant most of the Avengers were carrying general-purpose bombs rather than torpedoes. It did not matter. Sprague launched everything he had, and when his aircraft ran out of ammunition, ordnance and fuel, he ordered them to make dry runs, to dive on Japanese ships with empty bomb bays, with nothing, purely to force Japanese gunners to break their aim and Japanese captains to take evasive action. Hold that image. American pilots making attack runs with no weapons, knowing that if a Japanese gunner held his nerve and fired, there was nothing in the cockpit to save them. They did it anyway. The third weapon was the destroyers. At 6:55, Admiral Sprague ordered his 3 destroyers, Johnston, Howell and Heermann, and his 4 destroyer escorts to attack. The order, as written in the action report, was to conduct a torpedo attack. What it meant in practice was, take your 2,000-ton ships and attack a fleet that includes Yamato. Commander Evans had already gone. Johnston was already at flank speed, already making smoke, already drawing fire from Yamato's 18-inch guns. The shell splashes around Johnston were enormous, columns of water 200 feet high, coloured purple from the dye marker in Yamato's shells. Evans drove through them. At 7:10, Johnston fired 10 Mark 15 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano at a range of roughly 10,000 yards. At least one torpedo hit. Kumano slowed, dropped out of line, was out of the battle. Seconds later, 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck Johnston in rapid succession. The hits destroyed her engine room, killed or wounded 40 men, blew off 2 of her 5 gunmats, cut her speed to 17 knots, and severed 2 fingers from Ernest Evans's right hand. Evans came out of the pilot house, bare-chested, one hand wrapped in a cloth, and continued to direct the battle by voice through a hatch in the deck. The destroyer Hull, under Commander Leon Kintberger, made 2 torpedo runs. On her first run, she fired 7 torpedoes at Yamato from a range of 9,000 yards. Yamato turned hard away to avoid them, the largest battleship ever built, forced to maneuver defensively by a 2,000-ton destroyer. On her second run, Hull fired her remaining 3 torpedoes. She was then struck by over 40 shell hits from Japanese ships. She sank at 8:55, with 253 of her crew of 326 dead. 253 men. Hold that number. The destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, a ship of 1,250 tons, armed with 2 5-inch guns, designed explicitly for submarine hunting, closed to within 4,000 yards of the heavy cruiser Chokai and fired her 3 torpedoes. She then opened fire with her 5-inch guns at point-blank range, firing over 600 rounds in less than an hour until her guns began to fail from overheating. She was then struck by 3 8-inch shells from Japanese heavy cruisers in rapid succession. The hits flooded her engine room and tore open her hull. She sank at 10:05. Of her 224-man crew, 89 were killed. The Samuel B. Roberts, 1,250 tons, against heavy cruisers, by choice. Here is what was happening on the Japanese side during all of this. Kurita had the battle won by every metric that exists. His ships were faster, larger, more heavily armed, and vastly more numerous. His heavy cruisers alone, each displacing over 13,000 tons, each armed with 8 or 10 8-inch guns, could individually destroy any ship in Taffy 3. He had 4 of them. He had 4 battleships behind them. He had Yamato, and he was losing control of his fleet. The smoke from Taffy 3's destroyers was dense and effective, cutting visibility to near zero at intervals. The air attacks were continuous and impossible to predict, aircraft appearing from every direction, some armed, some not, all requiring evasive action. The torpedo attacks from the destroyers forced constant course changes. Japanese ships were firing at each other through the smoke. Communications between Kurita's ships were breaking down. His cruisers, operating independently in the chaos, were chasing individual American ships rather than concentrating on the carriers. And Kurita, on the bridge of Yamato, had been forced to turn north, away from the battle, for over 10 minutes to avoid the torpedoes from Hull. The largest battleship ever built, running north, away from the fight, while a destroyer half the size of one of its gun turrets chased it. He had no clear picture of what he was facing. The air attacks, the torpedo attacks, the radio traffic he was intercepting, all of it suggested to him that he might be facing a much larger American force than he could see. Halsey's fast carriers had been reported in the area. Were these their aircraft? Were these fleet destroyers? Or something else? The smoke made it impossible to tell the size of the ships attacking him. The ferocity of the attack was inconsistent with what he knew about escort carriers and destroyer escorts. This is where the Tsushima inheritance became a weapon against its owners. The doctrine said, "Preserve your fleet for the decisive battle." The doctrine said, "Do not expend your battleships against an uncertain enemy when the decisive engagement may be waiting elsewhere." The doctrine said, "Kantai Kessen requires your main force intact." Kurita had already lost Musashi. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers before the battle began. He had been in the water when his flagship sank. He had been attacked for 2 days straight. He was exhausted. His staff was exhausted. And now, at approximately 9:11 on the morning of October 25th, with his cruisers in contact with Taffy 3's carriers and the invasion beaches of Leyte Gulf less than 40 miles away, with nothing between him and the destruction of the American invasion force, Kurita ordered a general recall. He turned around. The official reason given in his after-action report was that he wished to reassemble his scattered forces before proceeding to Leyte Gulf, and that he had received reports of a large American carrier force to the north. He wanted to engage that force first. There was no large American carrier force to the north. There was nothing to the north. Halsey was still 200 miles away chasing Ozawa. Kurita turned around, reassembled his fleet, and by mid-afternoon was retreating through the San Bernardino Strait. He never reached Leyte Gulf. Часть 4. Криминалистический вердикт. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The Battle off Samar on October 25, 1944, was not won by American firepower. Taffy 3's total armament, her 5-inch guns, her torpedoes, her aircraft, was insufficient to destroy a Japanese force of that size under any normal tactical calculation. 3 of her ships were sunk. 3 of her destroyers and destroyer escorts were lost. Johnston, Hull, Samuel B. Roberts, gone. 547 men from those 3 ships alone were killed in the battle, and hundreds more died in the water over the following days before rescue arrived. This was not a clean victory. It was a catastrophe that did not become a larger catastrophe. What turned the battle was 4 things, operating simultaneously in a system that none of them could have created alone. The first was time. Every minute that Taffy 3's destroyers and aircraft consumed, every torpedo run, every smokescreen, every dry attack by an aircraft with an empty bomb bay was a minute in which Kurita was not closing on the carriers. The battle lasted 2 hours and 43 minutes from first contact to Kurita's recall. In that time, the carriers had run over 50 miles to the southeast. The window for destroying them was closing with every passing minute. Time was the one resource Sprague could generate that Kurita could not recover. The second was confusion. Japanese doctrine, trained on Tsushima and refined over 4 decades, assumed the decisive battle would look like Tsushima. 2 organized fleets, identifiable formations, clear lines of engagement. What Kurita received instead was chaos. Smoke, aircraft from every direction, destroyers attacking from multiple angles simultaneously, ships appearing and disappearing. He could not form an accurate picture of what he was facing, and in the absence of an accurate picture, his training told him to be cautious. The very ferocity of the American defense, the willingness of destroyers and destroyer escorts to charge a battleship fleet, was so far outside his doctrinal expectations that it read as evidence of a larger force than actually existed. The third was the doctrine itself. Kantai Kessen required intact battleships. Every hit Kurita's ships took, every torpedo they had to maneuver to avoid, every minute of uncertainty about what larger American force might be in the area, all of it fed into a command psychology that had been trained for 40 years to preserve the battle fleet for the decisive engagement. Kurita did not know that the decisive engagement had already arrived. He thought he was still waiting for it. The fourth was the men of Taffy 3. Ernest Evans died in the water on October 25th. Johnston was sunk at 9:45. Evans was last seen in the water, swimming, directing survivors. He was not among those rescued. He was 28 years old when he was commissioned at Annapolis. He was 36 when Johnston went down. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. His citation reads, in part, that he fought his ship and his men with a sublime display of cool and deliberate courage. The language is formal and correct, and entirely inadequate to describe what he did. Leon Kintzberger survived. Howell's survivors spent 50 hours in the water before rescue arrived. Of 326 men aboard Howell, 253 were dead. The Samuel B. Roberts' survivors spent 50 hours in the water as well. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, survived. In his after-action report, he wrote that his crew had fought with the greatest possible gallantry. He recommended every man aboard for a decoration. He was not exaggerating. Clifton Sprague survived. He wrote in his action report that he could not understand why Kurita had broken off the engagement. He never fully understood it, and neither, entirely, did Kurita. In an interview after the war, Kurita said that he had believed he was facing a much larger American force than he actually encountered. He said that the attacks were so aggressive, so continuous, so apparently suicidal, that he concluded they could only be the screening force for a much larger fleet operating nearby. He was right that they were suicidal. He was wrong about the larger fleet. The carriers Gambier Bay, St. Lo, Fanshawe Bay, Gambier Bay was sunk by Japanese gunfire, the only American fleet carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the Pacific War. St. Lo was sunk by a kamikaze later that same morning. 23 American aircraft were lost. Over 1,000 American sailors died in the battle and in the water afterward. Japan lost 3 heavy cruisers sunk in the battle: Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya. 1 light cruiser damaged. Several destroyers damaged. The center force returned through San Bernardino Strait and never again threatened American operations in the Philippines. The Yamato survived the battle. She survived the Philippines campaign. She was sunk on April 7, 1945 by American carrier aircraft while on a one-way mission to Okinawa. She carried enough fuel for the voyage there, but not the return, because there was no fuel for the return. She took 10 torpedo hits and 5 bomb hits before she capsized and exploded. 2,747 men died with her. She was the last Japanese battleship to be sunk, and she was sunk the same way the Musashi had been sunk, by aircraft, not by the battleship-to-battleship decisive engagement she had been built to fight. The Kantai Kessen never happened. Not because the Americans refused to fight it, but because the Americans had found a different way to wage naval war. One built on submarines, carrier aviation, and logistics. that made the decisive battleship engagement obsolete before it could occur. The Japanese had built the most powerful battleships ever constructed, had trained their navy for 40 years around the doctrine of the decisive fleet engagement, had studied Tsushima until they could recite its lessons in their sleep, and in the end, Tsushima destroyed them. Not the battle, the idea of the battle. The certainty that the decisive moment was always one more engagement away, always requiring the fleet to be preserved for the real fight that had not yet arrived. That certainty walked Kurita's ships through the San Bernardino Strait, put them within 40 miles of the invasion beaches, handed him a victory that would have changed the course of the Pacific War, and then, when the moment came, whispered to him that this probably wasn't the decisive battle he was waiting for. He turned around. Taffy 3's dead were in the water by then, 3 destroyers sunk, 3 destroyer escorts damaged. Men burning in oil slicks, men clinging to debris, men who had driven their 2,000-ton ships at flank speed toward Yamato because there was nothing else to do and they had decided to do it anyway. The battle off Samar lasted 2 hours and 43 minutes. It ended not with a decisive American victory, but with a Japanese admiral who had everything he needed to win, deciding, for reasons that were entirely logical within his doctrinal framework, that he should preserve his forces for a better opportunity. There was no better opportunity. There never was one. If this investigation gives you a clearer picture of what happened in those 2 hours off the coast of Samar, not the simplified version where 13 American ships heroically destroyed the Japanese fleet, but the actual version, where 13 American ships bought enough time and created enough confusion to make a Japanese admiral doubt a victory he had already essentially won, press like. It keeps this story visible a little longer, and it matters. Clifton Sprague lived until 1955. He died at 51 of a heart attack in San Diego. He never wrote a memoir. He gave few interviews. In the interview he did give about the battle, he said the same thing he had said in his action report. He could not explain why Kurita turned back. He said it was the grace of God. He may have been right. But the forensic record suggests something else. It suggests that Kurita turned back because Ernest Evans didn't. Because when a 36-year-old man from Pawnee, Oklahoma, turns a 2,000-ton destroyer toward the largest battleship ever built and goes to flank speed, the thing that registers in a Japanese admiral's mind, trained on Tsushima, trained on the decisive battle, trained on the idea that rational men fight rational wars, is not the ship. It is the irrationality of the act, the sheer impossibility of it. Rational men do not do that, which meant that either these were not rational men, or there was something behind them that made their rationality irrelevant. Kurita chose to believe the second option. He was wrong. And that wrongness, that 40-year inheritance of a doctrine built on one perfect battle, fought in a different ocean, in a different century, is what saved the invasion of the Philippines, what preserved the American foothold in the Pacific, and what sent the largest battleship force Japan ever sent to sea, retreating through a strait in the dark. Not firepower, a wrong assumption, made by an admiral who had been trained his entire career to make exactly that kind of assumption at exactly that kind of moment.